There is a basement in Oxford, England, that most people will never see. It sits beneath the Sackler Library, behind locked, climate-controlled doors, inside acid-free archival boxes stacked floor to ceiling. The boxes contain roughly 500,000 fragments of ancient papyrus. Most of them have never been fully read. Most of them have never been published. And according to the researchers who have spent careers working through them, some of those fragments appear to contain texts that were supposed to have been destroyed 2,000 years ago. Not lost, not misattributed, destroyed, burned, gone from human history. But here's where it gets strange. They're not gone, and the fire that supposedly ended them may not have happened the way we were told. If you're new here, subscribe now, because this channel is where the footnotes become the headline. The standard story goes like this. The Library of Alexandria, the greatest collection of knowledge in the ancient world, was burned during Julius Caesar's siege of the city in 48 BC. The scrolls burned. The knowledge burned. Civilization lost centuries of science, mathematics, medicine, and philosophy in a single night of fire and conquest. It's taught in schools. It's repeated in documentaries. It is, in almost every meaningful sense, treated as settled history. But that explanation has a problem. Several problems, actually. The primary source for Caesar's fire is Plutarch, writing 150 years after the event. He describes ships burning in the harbor. He mentions fire spreading to the docks. He references 40,000 scrolls stored near the port. But the library itself, the Mausoleum, the Royal Research Institution, the actual building with the actual collection, sat inland, attached to the Royal Palace complex. Not at the waterfront, not near the docks. The coordinates don't match the catastrophe we've been sold. For decades, scholars dismissed the discrepancy as symbolic. The fire stood in for cultural loss. It was a useful metaphor. Then, modern archaeology found something that changed everything. In 1896, two Oxford excavators named Bernard Grenfell and Arthur Hunt traveled to a garbage dump in the Egyptian desert, roughly 160 kilometers south of Cairo, in a region called Oxyrhynchus. What they found there was not what anyone expected from a rubbish heap. Buried under meters of dry desert sand were approximately 500,000 papyrus fragments, texts, documents, literary works, medical treatises, astronomical tables, philosophical dialogues, plays by Sophocles and Menander that had vanished from recorded history. Not copies, not summaries, original texts, in original hands, written in Greek and Demotic and Coptic. Some of them cataloged with scribal notations that matched the organizational system used by Callimachus of Cyrene, the head librarian who compiled the Penakes, the 120-volume master index of the Alexandrian collection. Not similar, not inspired by it, the same. Here's clue 1. Ancient sources describe a practice called the apotheke, a secondary deposit system, in which overflow scrolls from the Mausoleum were stored in satellite locations throughout Egypt. The mainstream interpretation has always been that these were minor administrative outposts, regional branches, nothing significant. But when you map the Oxyrhynchus fragments against the Penakes catalog descriptions that survive in later Latin references, the overlap is not random. The subjects, the author names, the scroll numbering conventions, they correspond to the same organizational logic as the central library. These weren't overflow files. This was a deliberate dispersal, systematic, planned. They weren't guessing. They were protecting. Clue 2. Strabo, the Greek geographer, visited Alexandria around 25 BC, almost 20 years after Caesar's siege, and wrote a detailed description of the Mausoleum complex. He described the library building. He described the lecture halls. He described the dining hall where scholars gathered. He did not describe ruins. He did not describe ash or reconstruction. He described a functioning institution, intact, operational. If Caesar's fire had consumed the library, Strabo either didn't notice or didn't bother to mention it. That silence is not an editorial choice. It's an archaeological clue. Clue 3. The Serapeum, Alexandria's second great temple complex, which housed what ancient writers called the daughter library, was destroyed in 391 AD by a Christian mob under the authority of Bishop Theophilus. This is well documented, but what the historical record almost never discusses is what lay beneath the Serapeum. Ancient texts describe underground chambers, called the Adtaion, running beneath the temple floor. In 2004, a team from the Polish-Egyptian Archaeological Mission conducted ground-penetrating radar surveys of the Kom el Dika district in modern Alexandria and detected a series of subsurface voids and tunnel networks beneath the old Rakotis quarter, precisely where the Serapeum once stood. The voids ranged in depth from 4 to 12 meters. Access tunnels, possibly. Storage chambers, possibly. The radar scans were published in a preliminary report. And then the follow-up excavation was halted. The permits were not renewed. The report was not expanded. The researchers went quiet. Now, does this prove the most extreme version of the story? Probably not. But that doesn't make the discovery ordinary. The mundane explanation is that the tunnels are Roman-era cisterns, of which Alexandria had many. That's plausible, that's defensible. But it doesn't explain why the spatial distribution of those voids maps almost exactly onto the footprint of the underground annex described in a 3rd century text by Epiphanius of Salamis, who wrote that the Serapeum's lower chambers contained sealed jars, each holding a rolled document and a cedar oil preservative, a preservation method archaeologists know was used for high-value papyrus storage in exactly this period. It was sealed, it was mapped, and then it disappeared. Back in Oxford, of those 500,000 Oxyrhynchus fragments, fewer than 5,000 have been fully translated and published. The rest sit in boxes. In 2020, a multispectral imaging project run by the University of Oxford began re-examining fragments that earlier scholars had catalogued as illegible. Fragments dismissed because the ink had faded below visible light thresholds. Under infrared and ultraviolet imaging, text began to reappear. In one fragment, catalogued only as P-Oxy, 5,765, researchers identified a passage from what appears to be a previously unknown astronomical treatise, referencing planetary cycles, using a mathematical framework that does not appear again in the historical record until Kepler. Not coincidence, not approximation, the same framework. And if that's true, it means our history is missing a chapter. Not because the knowledge was burned, but because it was moved, hidden, scattered across the desert, in sealed jars and buried garbage heaps and underground temple chambers, waiting for the empire to pass, waiting for someone to come back for it. Someone who never came. The 500,000 fragments in Oxford are still there. The radar voids beneath Alexandria are still there. Unexcavated, unread. The permits were never renewed. The boxes remain sealed. The text on P-Oxy, 5,765, is still being analyzed. No final report has been published. Most people walk right past it, but somewhere beneath the concrete and the traffic noise of modern Alexandria, at a depth of somewhere between 4 and 12 meters, there may be jars. There may be scrolls. There may be knowledge that has been waiting in the dark and the dry since before the Roman Empire fell. And we haven't opened them yet. If this kind of investigation is what you're here for, hit like and subscribe. There are channels that tell you what history decided. This one looks at what history left behind. The next video goes somewhere you won't expect. It starts with a map that shouldn't exist, drawn by an admiral who died 500 years ago, and it shows a coastline that wasn't discovered until 300 years after his death. Don't scroll past it.